Thank you very much, Pippa, for your nice introduction. Indeed, these walks were very nice and thoughtful. Even we did not find a real agreement at the end. However, you will see some of your thoughts will be here. The title, as you can see, is quite a famous quotation from even a more famous political scientist most of you know in the room. And I will come back to this quotation during my talk. I will immediately start and show you the cognitive map which should lead me and which should lead you through my talk. I'm using concepts here, and concepts in political science, social science in general, are normally contested. And these concepts I'm using here are in particular contested. I'm talking about what I mean by democracy. I'm talking about the problems to conceptualize crisis of democracy. I very briefly talk about major findings and problems of democratic theory and crisis theory. And then I come back to this quotation and the famous political scientist talking about why do I think legitimacy, belief, is not enough to approach such a question, whether democracy is in crisis or not. And then I propose 3 theories how to look from an empirical point of view to this crisis question. The background of these empirical view is a book which we did at the WZB with my department, which we did not call deliberatively crisis of democracy, but crisis and democracy. I think there is quite an important semantic difference. I'm not talking about these 503 adjectives which are used in the literature in order to specify about which democracy we are talking. And here I'm just presenting certainly an under-complex subsumption of these different concepts of democracy under 3 headings. The one are the minimalists. Minimalists, this is clear to you, are those who think it's not only that elections are the most important part of democracies, general and free and sometimes fair election, but they are the essence, they are democracy itself. There's a group of people who thinks elections cannot be anything and cannot be everything of democracies. There must be something more. And of course, in the forefront is Jürgen Habermas, who talks about the co-originality of civic and political rights. There are minor and less known political scientists here in this line, and they also think elections cannot be the only thing in order to judge whether a democracy is in crisis or not. And then you have maximalists. Maximalists have been throughout the last 3 decades a dying species. It was very important in the 60s and the 70s, and maximalists are distinguished themselves from the 2 first groups, that they are not looking only to input factors or throughput factors, to use the terminology of David Easton, but they are also looking at outputs. But if you have such a maximalist concept, where I have sometimes, if I write theoretical pieces, I have a normative preference for it, it's clear they cannot travel. They can especially not travel to the United States, and you cannot really use it if you do large and comparative research on the development of democracy. Here my point is basically that I'm arguing the type of democracy you are relying on determines to a large extent the sample of those countries who may be in crisis. If you are choosing a minimalist concept, only looking at elections, you will not have a large sample of countries. But if, of course, you have a maximalist concept, you will see more or less each country, or you can come up with a conclusion they are in crisis. Maybe these wonderful, nice, cozy Scandinavian countries as an exemption. This is, and I don't run through everything, this is what I do understand as a mid-range concept of democracy. And you see here the core is also, the core are elections. But in order to make democratic elections democratically meaningful, they have to be embedded. Embedded is one of my preferred terms I'm using here. They have to be embedded in other partial regime. I'm talking here about 5 partial regimes which constitute a rule of law-based democracy. I prefer rule of law-based democracy to liberal democracy because liberal democracy is differently understood in many European countries and the United States. So you need these regimes of political rights and of civil rights. You need checks and balances. And you also need an effective power to govern. And here I should explain briefly what I mean. I argue that in democracies only those authorities are legitimized to launch authoritatively binding decisions for the whole society which are elected for these decisions. If we look to Latin America, to Asia, to not so well established democracy, you will see very often military is such an actor which challenged the effective power to govern of democratically elected regimes. But you don't have only to look to these countries. Look into the European Union, for example. Look at the role of central banks. Who the hell has legitimized Mario Draghi to solve parts of the euro crisis? He did. He did on democratically very loose ground. However, economically, I would say it was the right thing to do. And you have challenges coming. So what I have placed here in the corner, certainly not the only one, but the major one I see at the beginning of the 21st century. And I see socio-economic inequality as one of these challenges. I come back to this point. Certainly globalization, but I also see the Europeanization of domestic politics as a tremendous challenge of democracies which are not solved yet in the European Union. And there is something which is more problematic: heterogeneity in ethnic terms, heterogeneity in religious terms, meaning this is something which explains to some extent the emergence of the radical or populist right in Europe. So this is what I understand as democracy, and to some extent, if you have these 5 partial regimes, you can locate much better where does democracy has problems which it has not solved yet, and you even can follow on a kind of trajectory where the virus of defects, of democratic defects, is spreading across the whole regime. I distinguish 2 types of crisis. The one is a more unproblematic one, coming from the medical metaphor of a crisis of human beings, human individuals, meaning if you don't bring in the right cure, the right medicine, then the patient will die. So this kind of crisis is an existential one, and is a question of death or life of democracy. Book of a well-known political scientist or historian as well here in the room. So there's a crossroad. There are fundamental decisions required, and I just listed some of these examples where the countries has seen such a crisis. And very often you can only state ex post whether a regime was in crisis because it collapsed. This is one of the problems. The second concept or meaning of crisis certainly has. Here, crisis is understood as a slow decline, an erosion of the quality of democracy. This is, by the way, the way in which the term crisis is mostly used if it comes to democracy, if we are talking about the 30 or 40 OECD democracies. It starts very much in the 1970s again. By the way, the term crisis and democracy is associated now for more than 2,000 years. We have it in the writing of Plato, Aristotle, Polybius, but it popped up again in the 1970s, and one of the main books was Habermas' book on the crisis of legitimacy. Here, crisis is understood that democracy, real existing democracies, do not fulfill the normative promises of democracy. This can lead to what Collier, Levitsky, and others have called a diminished subtype. There are still democracies. There's to some extent regular and general and free and sometimes even fair elections. But the other partial regimes are under tremendous pressure, and you can locate democratic deficits within them. One of the major problems this concept of crisis has, it cannot determine when a crisis begins and when it ends. And if you read the articles of my good colleague and friend Klaus Offe, then you will see democracy is permanently in crisis since the 1970s. But then the meaning of crisis becomes semantically meaningless. If crisis is a normal state of democracy, why should we use then such a term? And here is clear, if you are relying your analysis, or if you base your analysis on such a more loose concept of crisis, you will have quite a large sample of cases. However, the threshold question is not resolved. And I still think this is not occasionally the case, because I don't see how you really can determine a non-arbitrary threshold between crisis and non-crisis. So a crisis theory should explain which are the property of a crisis. Here the Habermas, Offe, Jim O'Connor, Colin Crouch, just to name a few, are quite good in defining these properties. They are not so good what a necessary and sufficient condition is, to use these terms from Aristotelian logic. And of course, what I have said, threshold questions are not solved. Causes and effects, they are much better, but it's quite interesting that very often they think an economic crisis determines and triggers a political crisis, a crisis of democracy. I would argue now it's more the triumph of a specific type of economy, the triumph of capitalism, which challenges the working of democracy. So it's not the crisis, it is the triumph of capitalism. Just to show you that I read some of these crisis theories, and they are, of course, much more complex than here, but I tried to filter out the main argument. There's the legitimacy crisis, and here the major point is there is at a certain stage of the development of the crisis, the people withdraw their support from the most important democratic institutions and organizations. Only 2 years later, we had this commission, the Trilateral Commission, under the obvious leadership of Sam Huntington. They are talking, governments are therefore in a crisis because they became big governments. They took on too many obligations and they cannot fulfill them. And there is also too high demand of citizens for participation and material goods and services. Then the globalization, I leave this out, and this is this famous essay by Colin Crouch. And then multiculturalism, if somebody read this strange book of Sam Huntington, which is quite good at the beginning, but at the end he obviously loses his mind sometimes. So he sees everywhere these, especially the Hispanization of the United States. In Germany or in continental Europe, they would see the Islamization of the community. However, there is certainly a subjective perception of parts of the population which conceive this as a threat to a certain object of the political regime, meaning the political community, or if you want to use another term, the nation. I skipped this and I briefly tell you how we tried to make sense of the question. We used 3 types of analysis. We is not the pluralis majestatis, this is the group at the WZB. We first followed the famous Weberian or Pippa-Norris track. We were looking at legitimacy belief. What do the people think? Should it be not the most important thing, what the demos think? And if the demos think that democracy is in a crisis, then he could be the last arbiter. Could he? I don't think he can be the only group who can judge whether a democracy is in crisis. You need normative standards. Otherwise, you will find many examples in history where the people think they are, or the people think their regime is legitimate. You will find it among the question if you ask Chinese people, the demos. Does your democracy work very well? You will get better results than from the Japanese population. Of course, experts will judge it quite differently. So we were looking to expert judgments, to indices which measure the quality of democracy, but then we thought this cannot be enough. There must be something behind it. So then we were looking to partial policy or to one of these partial regimes. For example, are civic rights challenged by the so-called war against terrorism. So here I would say, also to provoke Pippa a bit, that the reduction of legitimacy belief cannot be sufficient if we try to answer these questions. So the demos, here the Eurodemos, or I would say Eurodemoi, because the Eurodemos does not exist, or not really exist. We were looking what the people, the citizens of the European member state, from the European community, and starts in 73, up to the European Union, and here I have figures until 2010. What is quite interesting here, first, the trend, here you see indeed the trendless fluctuation. It's completely clear, you cannot anything interpret here as a decline of legitimacy, belief in European democracies. Quite interesting, the green line here. This is Italy. And this is more or less 92, 93. This was Tangentopoli, the collapse of the old party regime. And we all know who came along, our friend Silvio. And Silvio, when Silvio Berlusconi governed in three or four governments during this time, the Italians believed that the democracy is working better and better. They were more satisfied. If you look then so the people think democracy is much better after Berlusconi. If you look then, I come back to this. This is the expert judgment, the best you can find, the Eurobarometer. It's one of the best because it's done by the University of Zurich and the WZB. We are using 100 indicators to measure the quality of democracy. You can see everything, each single indicator and data in the internet. You see here the average. Again, the average does not tell you in the judgment that there is a worsening of democracy. I was quite disappointed about these results, and I asked my collaborators to look closer to it. However, the graph did not change. You have here again Italy. This is here 93, and then you have what the experts are judging the quality of democracy expectedly having a lower, Italy has now a lower quality than it had before. So the experts are judging differently from the demos, something quite interesting, who at the end is the arbiter. I want to show you another brief graph. Here I distinguish between two types of institutions. To look behind the wheel of this common satisfaction with democracy. And if you distinguish here non-majoritarian institutions, this is military, police, and judiciary. These are those institutions of the state which a citizen cannot elect. And they have high trust in them. And those where the citizens have a say, which they can elect, here parliament and the blue line governments, there is a visibly decline. So here you don't see only trendless fluctuation. Here I see quite a stable decline. Unfortunately, we did not have figures which are going back in the 80s and 70s, but here I see a clear trend, and political parties anyway is something where the people do not have high trust. However, here there are methodological questions. If you ask people, do you trust the party you voted for, you get much better results. So, but this would not really fit my argument here. But what you can see, there is a difference. And there's a difference, and one could argue, yes, the people trust in these non-majoritarian state institutions, but they do not have trust in the very much anymore, or declining trust in the core institutions of representative democracy. Last and third level, we were looking to partial regimes. There will be, hopefully soon, the book come out in English. It is now under review with Oxford University Press. And what we found out is the following one. Looking at the electoral regime, who votes? First, you find a visible, however not dramatic, but steady decline of voter turnout. This is a tricky thing to interpret it. Is it really a challenge to democracy? However, then we looked who is opting out, who does not go anymore to the elections, and we discovered social selectivity. Those who are anyway not going as much to elections, the lower third of the society, is dropping out more, visibly more than the higher social strata. We looked at the level of education in order to check it. So Bernhard Wessel has here quite nice data. Political rights, then we were looking who is represented in parliament. We were not looking at descriptive representation, not looking whether women, for example, are better represented. They are much better represented than they were represented 40 years ago. This is something which one has clearly to state. We were looking to substantial representation, and here again we found out, empirical research found out, that the lower third, those with only a primary education, are worse represented in parliament than the middle classes and the higher classes. What we have, if we look to the third partial regime, civil rights, who is protected? We have certainly a better protection of minority rights than 40 years ago. I'm saying this just to hint at the fact there are dissimultaneous development. This is what the crisis theories are not taking sufficiently into account. They are just picking out the negative results because they don't have a theory how to discount positive and negative developments. Here, civil rights, the right of homosexual, of ethnic minorities, of religious minorities, and so forth, not to talk about women, it's much better than it was 40 or 50 years ago. However, the bad news is certainly about horizontal accountability, who controls. This is something where we want to do more research, but with the opening up of the domestic polities, with Europeanization and globalization, parliaments are losing a lot of their control capacity. Some matters are even no longer decided there. They may be decided by deregulated financial markets, or they may be decided by institutions of the European Union or by other supranational regimes. And in the same way, I would say, who governs, there is a loss of state power to markets. So this is self-inflicted by democratic decisions of democracies to deregulate the market. Now they do not have a grip anymore on these markets, and they got driven in times of crisis, as we have seen in the crisis, especially of the euro, more than in the general financial crisis. Conclusion. The problem is with such a question of is there a crisis of democracy? Holistic crisis theories cannot be satisfactorily tested. This is one of the problems. However, I would refrain then from arguing if you cannot test it, then it's not a question we should look into it. This is, however, then we have to be keen in which way we are looking into those questions, and therefore we were using these three strategies. As you have seen, if you just look at democracy indices, you don't find a crisis of democracy. However, if you look behind the veil of the general survey question, are you satisfied with your democracy? We see this divide between majoritarian and non-majoritarian institutions. This is what I already have said, what I think, and I repeat it here as a ceterum censeo, political inequality matters. There seems to be quite a straight transformation of socio-economic inequalities into political inequalities. And this is now even worse because the lower strata were very much relying on the judgment, a kind of cognitive shortcut of collective organizations such as trade unions or working class parties, and there is a clear erosion of these parties, and the lower classes today are quite different from the working class of the 1960s and 70s. Working class is no longer what we would consider the lower classes of our societies. Deregulation of markets matter. This is one of the points where I think the Euro crisis has given quite an empirical evidence on this question that there's not much space for democratic decisions to guide the working of markets, and these are not minor questions. These are major questions for the life of the people. Pippa, I quote you again, so your citation index will rise. The majority of the citizens may be less critical, as a title of one of your books suggests, critical citizens. So the people seem to be more output oriented, and they do not judge it as so problematic in its majority. Not the young, well-educated people organized in NGOs, certainly not, but again, the lower 30 or 50% of the population. They may not care. They may not care that there is a shift to a more executive-driven, less controlled democratic polity. Last, and I finish, unfortunately, with a pessimistic argument, knowing that John Keane is always more optimistic than me in these matters. If we look to democratic innovations, and there is an ongoing intensive debate, how can we cure these malaises of representative democracy? There is an emergence of the debate on direct democracy. And I just came back from a complete different scene of political scientists compared to you sitting here from Canberra. I had the pleasure to discuss 2 days deliberative democracy. And the moment where I mentioned parties, elections, what are you talking about? This is a matter of the past. We have to talk about deliberation. But my argument is, all what we know about these nice innovations of democracy, direct democracy, referenda, deliberative democracy, digital democracy, they are socially even more selective. They are more demanding. They are more demanding in terms of cognitive capabilities. And so it may be not the cure for these malaises of representative democracy. It may be the acceleration of it. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Wolfgang. So John will respond and give his perspective.
Well, herzlichen Dank. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have you here in Sydney again, and thank you too for Pippa for the invitation. To summarize, there is an old joke that what is an optimist? You did mention these terms. An optimist is someone who thinks that things could be much worse than they are, and probably that's a summary of Wolfgang's paper. And I'm, you say I'm an optimist, but broadly I'm in agreement. But there are 4 things that I want to say that complicate the argument and the conceptual handling and the implications that you drew. You are, as a preamble, it's important to see that what you, the reservation you have about this concept of crisis is, I think, correct. I think the reservation is that this is a very strong term, and as you say from Hippocrates, crisis is a medical term, and it is a crucial turning point where the life and death of the patient is at stake. Its root term in Greek, I understand, is to decide or to judge. So a crisis is a turning point, a moment, a dramatic moment where something may not survive unless there is a change of course through decisions, through judgments. In this sense, the term is a strong term. It has connotations of dysfunctionality, of death. Torschlusspanik in German is midlife crisis. And it literally means that it's a sort of shut the door panic, the fear that you're on the wrong side of the closing door. So it's a very dramatic term, and rightly, I think, you point out that there is probably either a need to drop the term or to moderate it, to take account of the trending disintegrations and transformations that normally the concept wouldn't be used to describe. I want to say four things. One is on the basis of an agreement with your point about the need to set aside a dramatic concept of crisis. One of them is, it's the most abstract philosophical point that you could have made. Democracy is the most radical political form so far invented. And it's the most radical because its core principle is equalization of power and life chances and identities. In this sense, as I'd say the French school, but going back to Tocqueville, but today's French school, Jean-Louis Nancy and so on, point out, democracy is the friend of crisis. If you think about it very abstractly, it is always, democrats and democratic institutions are always, when they work properly, they are always looking to undermine inequities. So there is constantly dissatisfaction, motion, the promiscuity of the spirit of democracy. It's always unfinished business. Derrida's democracy to come is the shortest sentence to summarize this. So it may be that actually there is an affinity between the concept of crisis and democracy that you could have spoken about. That would probably work in your favor, that we should calm down a little bit. If I had time, I would say a lot about intellectuals and crisis. I think we intellectuals, maybe we're overstating our role, but I think we have a certain predilection for talking, crisis, and there's a whole history of that, but that I won't say much about. Second, it's fair to say, and it didn't come through clearly enough for me, that the reigning orthodox, usually it's called liberal democratic, you call it rule of law democracy model, is disintegrating. It has a declining plausibility. There is a sort of slow burn crisis in your sense of this orthodox model, which you can find in many fields of political science and other areas of the human sciences. What was this model? I speak about it in past tense. 4 qualities were always listed in this orthodox liberal democratic model. You have to have a territorial state that guarantees sovereignty, and it's better to have a shared sense of nationhood. Fukuyama has once again repeated this in the most recent volume that he's published. Second, a democracy, so something prior to elections, but democracy is secondly a form, political form, where the people are sovereign. Third, the core institution is periodic elections and a form of elected representation, so parliaments and so on. And the fourth is that it's always in the liberal democratic reigning orthodox model that there should be rule of law, there should be a civil society, and there should be markets. These are usually bundled up as the fourth quality. Now, it does seem to me that it's implicit in some of what you say. Pippa will not like this at all, but it does seem to me, thirdly, that there are things going on empirically that do deeply call this model into question. The third point, this is a reference to the geographic differentiations. You didn't say much about this. There are polities that I would say on empirical grounds, however you measure it, are actually in at least a slow burn crisis and possibly something more calamitous than that. And I think the instances are Greece. I think the experience of Greece in the last 6 years and the unresolved dynamics, the heavy politics that, having just come back from Europe, you see if you're on the ground there. It's really heavy politics, where there is a kind of hatred of the Troika, and where negotiations behind scenes, when Tsipras meets Draghi, they barely can be in the same room as each other. And there is something, the imposition of austerity and the collapse of a market economy. And one could also say, in Hong Kong, there is a crisis in the at least slow burn variety. But I don't want to say anything more about that. And finally, we probably need a term like trending transformations, Pippa. Trending transformations, or transformational trends or something. Let's call them trending transformations. I think that what's missing, we talked about it for years, is that political science is full of amnesiacs. There's no understanding much of the past, and we have no data, and the past is just a sort of, it's a sort of grey area. If you put on a pair of eyes, so to say, in the back of your head and think about some of the bigger trends, which would be the only way that you could talk about these trending transformations, you see at least 4 things going on. And I'd say that these need to be built into your account, and they have implications for the electoral integrity project. I don't think they destroy the project. That's the happy news, Pippa. I think, on the contrary, they might well give it a new significance. But the 4 trends are, you briefly touched on this, the growth, the pluralization of forms of unelected representation. It's happening. And I'd say among the very best works that you could read, it's a bit of a slog, is Pierre Rosenballon's relatively recently translated book on legitimacy. My Monetary Democracy, which is the 504th definition of democracy, is a contribution to this. The argument is that since roughly 1945, when there were only a dozen democracies, electoral democracies left on the face of the earth, we've seen the growth of innovations, of the pluralization of forms of unelected representation that greatly change the ecology and dynamics and help, as Rosenballon himself points out, help us understand, though we don't have good theories of it, that elections are only one way of handling power. And it may be that there is a certain desacralization of elections going on in every or most electoral democracies. In other words, democracies require a more complicated ecology of handling power and forms of legitimacy. Some of them predate the post-45 period. Election commissions are a very basic example. The pouvoir neutre that was much discussed in the meeting. An elected election commission would be a disaster for every democracy because it politicizes it in a way, in party political terms. If you think about it, why the election commission in India is one of the most publicly, there's greatest public loyalty to it, is because it isn't elected. Rosenballon reminds us that the public service model was a basic invention of the great crisis of democracy, and it was from roughly 1890 to 1939. Today, the ABC is much more popular than any party. How do you explain this? It is a form of representation. It represents opinions in all their diversity, and it does so in largely a non-market way, and it does so sometimes by heaping abuse and criticism on the electoral mechanisms, and for those reasons it is popular. You mentioned central banks. I want to steer away from that for a moment, but they're often cited as another instance of unelected representation. My own view is that the European Central Bank, as has been pointed out by Harold James, had a bad beginning. It was basically an institution set up by the banks. And that is one of the reasons why, you know, it's hated in some parts. The Germans, I didn't mention. I do think, to just sketch this final point about one trend, I think that the growth of new network politics, you know, this new type of politics that's outside the election system, that occupies physical place, that is multi-mediated, that broadcasts to the world complaints, that is a contribution to a form of the spread of forms of representation that are not elected. And then all of the monetary institutions, these watchdogs and barking dog institutions, many of them are much more popular than parties and parliaments. And by the way, they are, I know you like this thesis that they're socially selective. That is not true for India, and it is not true for Latin America. Many of these institutions, local religious courts and satyagraha and so on, I mean, these are all inventions of the post-45 period that are outside the electoral cycle and which add a certain dynamism and complexity and a rough and tumble to democracy. And that's good, it seems to me, but it has implications for electoral understandings of democracy. I'll quickly finish because there are three other trends I want to say something about. Second big trend is the growth of cross-border chains of power. I suppose if you want one symbol of this, it might be the National Security Agency. And the counterpoint is the growth of efforts to democratize those chains of power. That is, what I think is happening globally is that the spirit of democracy has sort of escaped from the territorial straitjacket, and there are efforts to try to build mechanisms that restrain arbitrary power in cross-border settings. The growth of global publics is a very clear instance, but we have all kinds of networks that operate to try to actually add substance to the meaning of global democracy or cross-border democracy. This is significant. The last time there was such a discussion was in the 1920s, when, of course, global democracy was defeated politically by war and fascism and so on. Third trend is the greening of democracy. I think the growth, the invention, and the spread of mechanisms of representation of our relationship with the biosphere is it's a novelty of our times. It is entirely positive. It is badly theorized. And many of the mechanisms of representation are unelected. Green parties are an exception. But, for example, the growth of citizen science networks or food sovereignty initiatives, or, for example, bioregional assemblies, the constitutionalization of the biosphere. It's happened first in Bhutan, and it happened second in Mongolia, and I checked. That to be a citizen is to be duty-bound to protect the biosphere of the polity in which one lives. This is something new, and it is one of these long-term trends that greatly complicates the Orthodox model. And finally, the scariest thought, and here I get pessimistic. It does seem to me that the last great slow burn